final report from the Banking Royal Commission has now been handed down, and I have to say that I'm one of these people who thinks it was a little bit underwhelming in some of the recommendations that the Commissioner made. I was also one of the people who wasn't believing that there should have been a Royal Commission in the first place, but obviously after some of the evidence that was uncovered, I did do a mea culpa and say I was wrong in that regard. But I must admit, after all of the unethical and unexcusable behaviour that was uncovered by some of the testimony in the Royal Commission, the fact that the 76 recommendations were what I would consider quite weak on the banks was a little bit disappointing. But let's start with some of the positives. I think it was very positive that there were no new regulations handed down as such. I think Commissioner Hayne did allude to the fact that he didn't think that there needed to be any new regulation in the interim report, just better enforcement of the existing laws. I agreed with that, and I think it's good that we didn't get a whole raft of new regulations that would require more compliance activities. Another positive note was that he didn't opt for what I would consider the nuclear option of insisting that product manufacturers and financial advice providers completely separate their activity. That would probably have been too much of a disruptive element for the industry, which is obviously going through a lot of change at the moment already, and that may have been a bridge too far. So I think they're probably two of the positives. On the negative side of things, I think a lot of people were disappointed that no names were mentioned when recommendations of the referrals to ASIC for further investigation were made in the report. I think that's increasingly emphasised by the fact that he did single out Andrew Thorburn and Ken Henry from the NAB, that they didn't instill him with a lot of confidence that they'd got the message from all of the things that were uncovered with abhorrent behaviour during the Commission hearings. Now, I think that he's named those names because he felt they were a little bit petulant towards the Commission. But really, in comparison to some of the other people who were proven to be behind some unlawful behaviour, he should have named those names as well. I mean, I know that the Royal Commission, everybody knows that the Royal Commission can't actually commence criminal proceedings themselves. But I think the naming of names would have lended some gravity to how serious some of the stuff is that was uncovered and what sort of action we might be seeing taken against these individuals into the future. Of course, a whole raft of other changes to do with financial services, including the banning of grandfathered commissions. I think that was on the cards. I don't think that was a surprise to anybody. He's talking about taking risk advice commissions to zero. I'll have a little bit to say on that a little bit later in this editorial. He's proposing getting rid of commissions for mortgage brokers. He's prohibited the unsolicited selling or hawking of superannuation and insurance products. I think that's a plus. There's a new disciplinary body for advisors that's going to be set up. A new compensation scheme of last resort for investors in collapsed investment schemes, and a new 3-person oversight body for ASIC and APRA. Now, ASIC and APRA have been left to be the regulators, and a lot of faith has been put in them to see whether or not their enforcement activities can lead to a better result in the future. Now, this is definitely a watch and see in this space, because you're basically putting your faith in the two bodies that have let us down so far. So Let's see how that goes. They've got increased funding. There's obviously a slight structural change and a personnel change at ASIC, so we'll see how that goes. But let me get back onto the recommendation regarding commissions with risk advice. Now, I think the Commissioner, and this goes a long way to a lot of the discussion around this sector, the risk insurance sector. I think the Commissioner has kind of misunderstood how that whole sector works. He's recommended that the commissions in that area go to zero if ASIC's sort of monitoring of the new life insurance framework with its capped commissions to see if ASIC believes that it hasn't led to an underinsurance problem amongst consumers. He's then happy to go further and suggest that there should be zero commissions for any risk advice or advisors out there. Now, he's highlighted the fact that he doesn't want there to be an underinsurance problem, and he said that he didn't believe that if ASIC found that the LIF framework didn't lead to underinsurance, that he didn't believe taking commission to zero would lead to underinsurance either. There's a slight problem with that. I think most people in the industry recognise that risk and life insurance is something that needs to be sold and not bought. If you take away the incentives as to how you help consumers here, I don't think that's going to be a great outcome for them, and I do think that it will lead to more underinsurance. It certainly won't help that situation. I mean, if you've got incentives to sell those products right now and there already is an underinsurance problem, how is taking away those incentives going to fix that? I don't know. So I think there's been a slight misunderstanding of how that area works. As far as the mortgage broking, I know this isn't quite in the realm of financial services, but mortgage broking is sort of, the philosophy is along the same lines. If you ask consumers to pay for the brokerage fees themselves, I doubt they'll do it. History shows us that consumers do not like to pay upfront fees for brokerage charges. And if this leads to consumers having to shop around themselves and ultimately deal directly with the banks again, isn't that empowering the sector that you are trying to revamp and bring them into line so that some of their practices are more sound and obviously lawful? That seems to be a little bit counterproductive. I think it's good that the government is seriously considering how to go about supporting that measure. I should say the government said it will take action on all of the 76 recommendations, so I think that's good. But I think if ever there was a reinforcement of the idea that perhaps the final report was not hard enough on the banks and the financial institutions it looked at during the Royal Commission, it would have to be the rebound that the ASX and the bank shares in particular experienced on Tuesday after the report had been handed down. Obviously, if there's a rebound, it was because the medicine that they had to take was not as bitter and not as severe as they expected. So obviously the outlook was a little bit more rosy than some of the doom and gloom that was possibly expected. The extent to which the rebound occurred meant that the ASX S&P 200 index reached its highest level in 10 years. I think that goes to show that maybe the perceptions around how hard the report was on the banking sector fell a little bit short.